Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. Since this is the second week of quarter, let me do a quick review of logistics for those of you who are taking it for credit. To get credit for the course, you need to see all of the sessions. Most 2 of them you can watch remotely. The rest you need to watch in the room unless you're on SCPD or something where it's all remote. Any questions? The TA for the course is Jesse over here in the corner, and he'll pass around a sign-up sheet. If you sign every time, you're done getting credit. If you miss the sign-up sheet, try to grab him after the session or send an email. And at the end, if you've had any you watched online, you will send us an email verifying that. So very simple, no complex requirements. And as always, if you're not taking it for credit, you're welcome to come to any of them you want. And to see them online. It takes a while before they go through the pipeline and end up on the iTunes site for Stanford, SCPD, and so on, but they do eventually. Except occasionally we'll have a speaker who doesn't want them recorded, and we'll let you know ahead of time if that's the case.
I didn't tell you
that. Just quick announcement, heads up. Next week we have Chris Harrison from Carnegie Mellon, who's looking at body-based input devices, like tapping on your own arm as an input device. It's interesting because Wynn, who we have today, Wynn Burleson from Arizona State, is a kind of bridge between last week and next week. Right. So last week we had Teresa Mobley, and she, along with Wynn, is looking at that side of human-computer interaction, which isn't the sort of straight cognitive thinking side, but the whole question of affect and motivation. She's looking at interaction in groups, he's looking at interaction with computers, but I think the thread there is there's a lot more to what's going on the people side than just what you think. It's the full human capacity. And in order to study that, he's using devices that get into the range of what Chris is doing in terms of sensors that are actually on your body finding out what you're doing. So I think the whole sequence actually has a nice sort of connection to it. One other connection, like Teresa last week, he's a graduate of Stanford, in particular from the product design program in mechanical engineering, which has been the source of a lot of the thinking about design and creativity around Stanford. He was at the MIT Media Lab, where he worked in the affective computing group with Roz Picard, and now has his own group at Arizona State, and we'll be describing the work.
Great, thank you, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about my work with the Motivational Environments Research Group, where I work on personalized cyber learning, and talk a little bit about the Inventor's Workshop and new ways of providing cyber learning for all transdisciplinary learning, intrinsically motivated learning. So thank you for the introduction. I do think that there, and you'll see direct connections, at least to Teresa Amabile's work. There's a piece here that I'll be talking about in terms of creativity research that we've been doing. I had the privilege of having Teresa on my general's exam committee at MIT Media Lab. So a full third of my work at the Media Lab focused in terms of my PhD, in terms of understanding the context of creativity, and as you'll see in my talk, how I focused on the frustration and the fact of not being able to persevere, and how shifting one's perspectives of what's possible changes their ability to do not only mundane things, but extravagant, superlative things as well. So in terms of looking at Chris's work, again, the sensors are there, and not only looking at sensors as a direct feedback for the individual, but also that those sensors can be used for others. For example, for caretakers in home settings, that you have somebody with mild cognitive impairment and you want to provide feedback, perhaps not to the individual, but to the caretaker, measuring their level of arousal or frustration can be something that can be productive. And I'll touch a little bit on that as well. Before we get started, I just want to pose a little challenge. I'd like everybody to raise your left hand as high as you can. All right, great. Now I'd like people to raise their left hand 2 inches higher. Okay, and how about 2 feet higher? All right, how about a whole lot higher? Anyone feel that their hand is higher than anybody else's, or a lot higher than 2 feet higher than it was when I asked the question? Anybody want to propose a paradigm shift that might lead to that? Go upstairs? Go to the top of the building? Could you do it without going upstairs? Could you stay where you are and change the definition of where your origin is, for example? Like, from the middle of the earth, right? So thinking about the perception and its constraints is certainly something core to product design, this idea of express test cycle, to be able to see new opportunities. And it's also core to the flow experience, what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about as being the optimal experiences in life. And what I'll talk about a little bit, stuck, the non-optimal experiences, and getting out of stuck and getting into flow. So with that, I'd like to just start the talk and share with you a quote from Alan Kay. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. Back in 1968, he designed the Dynabook, what is largely attributed to be the origin of laptop computing or portable computing that is very prevalent today. We also have another emergence that's prevalent today, the going beyond the desktop, and work like Chris's and others looking at how do we expand even further than even in 68, Alan Kay was looking. And I think his words still hold true, that we can predict the future by inventing it. And so he went on to develop Walt Disney Imagineering, a place where they were inventing fantastic futures and sharing those with us for the past decades, many decades. And so that's part of the inspiration of thinking about how we can change our understanding. So hopefully many of you are familiar with this graphic. This is from the Stanford D School, and it's appreciation that the synergy between technology, business, and human values is where design innovation can come from. And I know, Terry probably worked on elements of this diagram itself, and others certainly have been involved. I've had the opportunity to, as Terry suggested, work at the design school, work at the Media Lab, and then also work at IBM Research and Harvard Business School, where Teresa Amabile was. And what I want to emphasize about these environments is their transdisciplinary nature and their willingness to go beyond the possible and think about how to invent the future. And that's what I've learned and want to share with you to some extent today. Hiroshi Ishii, some of you may recognize here, his words here, play is hard work. What we're trying to do is take hard work and make it into play. And so at ASU, we have a group called the Art Media Engineering Group, and we've redefined in some of the aspects of how a graduate curriculum could occur. And so we have master's and PhD programs in 16 different programs that come together and work on common large-scale projects together. So I just want to point that out there. We'll come back to reinventing or re-envisioning the university. I was interested in the intro. Terry said you can only get credit if you come here most of the time. And that's part of a debate these days in terms of what's the role of online education and what's the role of being in place-based environments. How do you credentialize that? You guys get credit by signing Jesse's form. Can we give you degrees for the resume that you have? If you've first authored a number of papers or been contributor on further papers, should we start to give you a degree for that? When and where? What value would that have? Does the CV become your credential? And so this broad thinking that we'll get to at the end of the lecture here. So I'd like to start off very specifically with my work on affective learning companions and creativity research. The latter is where you'll hear more about Teresa Amabile. Then I'd like to share with you how we're taking those strategies and bringing them into the broader context of everyday life with a project called Life is Game, Game is Life, and how those work together to change the way we do things, perceive things, and what might be possible. And then finally, in the Inventors Workshop, how we're looking at taking that to new forms of human-computer interaction and new forms of education. So, affective learning companions. In human-student interaction, humans are spending about 50% of their time on the motivational attributes of a learner. So if a learner is frustrated or stuck, the human will attend to that in an effort to maintain the engagement of that learner. And human tutoring is generally one of the best forms of education. It's very expensive and not very available, but it's a very high quality form of education. So that's where affective learning companions, intelligent tutoring systems that can provide one-on-one connection not only on the cognitive domain, but also on the affective domain come into play. And so in my work, I turn to the self-theories of intelligence that Carol Dweck proposed. She was a professor at Columbia, and now she's in the psych department here. And she has done a lot of work on people's beliefs about their intelligence. So people who believe that they cannot grow their intelligence, that they should rather find out what they're good at. She calls those individuals holders of trait beliefs. Their intelligence is fixed. It's a trait. It cannot be modified or adjusted. And so what you should do if you hold a trait belief is, if something gets hard, find something that you're good at. Stop doing that because it's too hard. You're not going to change your intelligence. And so people, she finds in that category, quit before they even understand that they could be good at something. So this is a lost learning opportunity. On the other hand, 40% of people hold incremental beliefs. They are excited by challenge and they move forward. They say, gee, I was hoping this was going to be exciting. And so when I asked you to raise the hand, maybe you have a self-assessment as to whether you were scared of that and not sure if you were going to get it right, or if you were excited by, hey, this new challenge. So Carol Dweck said, if I teach you that the brain is like a muscle and that it grows when challenged, if I do that in a convincing way, I can move people from trait to incremental beliefs. What she didn't do was understand that she could do that at the point of frustration or at the point when it would be most valuable. So she, not having the sensors and not having the intelligent tutoring system available to her, was able to do group level work in terms of understanding how this intervention could have a very important impact. What we can do with the added technology is that we can tailor it to the individual. And that's something we talked about at lunch before the talk about the movement from large group level effects to more and more individualized, personalized tailoring of one's technologies and of one's interactions. So we had conversations with her about whether this would be productive and found that applying this educational psychology to the domain of educational technology, we would have this opportunity to understand when people are doing well, when they're in flow, and when they're in stuck. And so flow, as you may recall, or let me introduce you to it, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came up with this theory and developed it over several decades of work, that an optimal experience, if you think of one of the best times in your life, maybe you were camping and saw a sunrise, maybe you were on a sporting field and shooting a ball or a goal, or playing music, getting it right, doing homework and discovering the answer, any of these could be flow experiences. And he says that these are 8 attributes that are common to flow experiences. You don't have to have all of them, but these are generally descriptive of that kind of experience, that it's all-encompassing, that you're in control, highly focused, a mental enjoyment, and a distortion of sense of time. So that time is either you have plenty of time to do something that that's critically needed right now. So you might feel like you have several minutes to dribble the ball around some defenders. Time stops and you can see yourself. It's often an out-of-body experience in the sense that you can see yourself from a third person. Many people describe it that way. And you have the ability to move around and shoot or do what you need to do. The distortion of sense of time can also be a very long period of time feeling very short. So you've been at something for hours and hours, and you're just amazed how quickly the time's gone because you've been in so much flow. But what this gets at is that there's a match between the challenge at hand, the activity that you're engaging in, and your own skill. And there's an optimal balance there that you, if it's too easy, then that challenge doesn't engage you. If it's too hard, then you get frustrating, and if you're trait-based, you tend to quit. So in general, it's frequently associated with positive experience. So in intelligent tutoring systems with affective learning companions, we needed to know when you were in flow so we don't disrupt you, because this is a very delicate experience. If we intervene and say, hey, how's it going, we can actually make you think too much about that and get you into some details. Oh, I'm stuck on this again, right? And now you're no longer in flow, right? And so we also wanted to know when you were stuck and we came up with a theory of stuck that directly parallels flow. It's all-encompassing, a feeling of being out of control, a lack of concentration or inability to focus, and a mental fatigue or distress, even with thinking about this. As students or in academia, often we might, and anybody has these kinds of experiences where procrastination or anxiety about the activity, even just thinking about it. When you actually do it, it might not be that hard, or sometimes you do it and you're like, oh, that's why I was so anxious about it, because it actually did take a very long period of time. Some work has shown that there's also a distortion of sense of time, and that by having frequent interruptions, if they're frustrating, if they're less polite or actually interrupt important events in your life, that you will say there were many more of them, and that there were, so that distortion of sense of time comes in the sense of number, but also so much more frequent. And then Zorinsky also showed that if something was frustrating, you would say, if it was only a 5-minute experience, you might say that it was 10 or 15 minutes, and because it was so frustrating. So there's this negative distortion of time. And what's very important for my work is that, and what I was talking about at the very beginning, is that it's the perception of the mismatch. If we can instead teach you that the mind is like a muscle, and that even if you're not any good at this, you still have a chance to grow your intelligence or learn something about it or about yourself, then you can change your perspective. You can change how high you can raise your hand, or whether you even want to raise your hand. Maybe you want to move your hand out to the right instead of up. You can go around the problem, find a new way or a new path. And then these are parts of the challenge and ability that you have to invent the future. And so by changing one's perspective, you can re-engage. And so we do this by understanding. Yes, we have a question.
If you can just go to the previous slide. So
it was up for a long time.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Sorry, I'm stuck. Okay, so the question.
As long as you're not stuck.
Yeah. So the question I have was, it seems like stuck is essentially the opposite of flow, but there may be a lot of experiences between those two things, and we can push them in either of the two directions.
Right. Well, flow has a rich description of many different kinds of experiences. So learning in flow is a little too hard to actually be in flow in general for most people. And so this notion, does that make sense? And if something's a little too easy, then it's relaxing or boring, right? And so if you look at the literature of flow, there's a number of different attributes. Like driving was an example of a little too easy. It's not actually, most of the time, hopefully, challenging enough to maintain a flow experience.
So I'm curious as to why these are actually such clear opposites in every dimension. So do you have any?
Well, I mean, I think the structure of stuck was created to inform our approach to when we would intervene. And this notion, so I don't feel that this was sort of a comprehensive study of the state of stuck or frustration, certainly not as much as Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. His work extended over decades and had many, many user groups. And so I think this was a representation of the kind of time in a learning experience when we'd like to intervene on behalf of a learner. And so in general, I think of stuck as primarily in the learning domain, although I'm not saying whether it can or can't be applied, and many people have applied to others. I just haven't looked closely enough at what attributes stay there or not.
Many, perhaps all of these, refer to a learning experience of an individual here, and of course, in reality, it's a person situation.
Like teams and classes
and teachers and multiple students, and the notion of control then comes up. For example, the notion of frustration has a different sense there. A multi-person affect or group affect in a sense. Will you be addressing that, or shall we stick with the?
I probably won't to in a direct way, but I will move from the learning companions to team behavior. Probably a little less on the sense of stuck at that time, but if I haven't addressed the topic and you want to come back to it at the questions at the end, we can bring it up. Great. Hey,
stuck seems like a really handy construct and one time that you would want to intervene. There are probably others also, like bored.
Right. Yeah, and right. So stuck is just one, and I'm just presenting one in which and I think that's a very helpful comment, right? There's that, so you can look at others which may be even positive, like play, or right. So if you're not necessarily engaged in the topic, but you're in flow but playing, we may or may not want to intervene, depending on how much playing you've done and what your relationship between play and flow and learning might be, right? So another attribute that I'll mention is deep and shallow learning. And so if we can model that, which we've written a paper about, then that's another more concrete form of saying what is the context and how can we react. Okay, so we have a number of sensors. I have a little video, so I won't dwell on those here. Suffice to say, a pressure chair, a skin conductance sensor, a pressure mouse, and a camera that can measure facial expressions can be aggregated to create elements of the sensing of experience. And this is a combination of hardware and software design experience, so iterating and designing usable, wearable, robust sensors that can be deployed over long periods of time into classrooms and homes and various contexts is an important part of this sort of integrated work where you have to have backgrounds, as I have, in, say, physics or in product design and then in the human-computer interaction and testing of these systems. So this is the overall system. The screen had a character that was developed by Ken Perlin, and Ken Perlin is very well known for his work in graphics and real-time feedback. And so this character was scriptable. It could react to the sensor input in real time. And we had a behavior engine that we linked in, translating the motion, the sensed activity into the character behavior. And we'll see that in this video here. So maybe, I don't know if the lights need to be dimmed, but lights dimmed, please. So here we have a young woman sitting here with the skin conductance sensor that has gotten much smaller on her left wrist and the pressure mouse. In the background, you can see a facial expression camera. That wouldn't be there for most participants, but for the video, you see that sensor as well. And she's sitting on a postured chair. So we'll look through each of these sensors in sequence. The color swatches are covering force-sensitive resistors, and we've built these systems. And we can measure in real time across all the sensors the amount of squeezing or pressure that is occurring. And we mapped that in this study to agitation in the character. The character would sway more or agitate more as a form of mirroring your emotion. And I'll talk about mirroring after the video. Skin conductance was measured, in this case, on the palm of the wrist, and now more recently on the wrist itself. And this, again, is a form of a graph of that measure. And what we did with the skin conductance was looking at the pigmentation. Again, a form of mirroring, a design choice that we said, OK, this isn't mirrored in human-to-human interaction directly, but maybe we can map it to pigmentation. In the posture chair, we have, as you see here, pressure below the sit bones and on the shoulder blades, and then the overall activity and classification of the type of sitting that is engaged. And what's fun here is we can have an interpersonal distance. The character just leaned back when you were leaning back and leaned forward. And that changes this interpersonal distance that you might have with the character. You see a light square around the mouth. We have head nod, mouth fidget, blinking, and pupil dilation at the bottom, smile. And so we're looking for retroreflection in the pupils and then able to classify the mouth. And we can mirror those behaviors with the character in terms of the body posture or the head posture and the facial expression. So let me talk just for a moment. Lights on, please. About mirroring. Online. Yes, the video is online. Yeah. The mirroring has been shown to be productive by another Stanford professor, Jeremy Burleson, in his work on persuasion and likability. And that was a very critical element in addition to Dweck's that informed the approach to this research. So we compared mirroring and non-mirroring in this work and looked at how that affected the children as well. These children were 11 to 13-year-olds doing the Towers of Hanoi activity. We calibrated the activity with 7 discs, so they couldn't finish. They would get frustrated. We had to do pilot studies to determine how much frustration. I talked a little bit about well, we talked about mirroring, but the design of the mirroring. And so it's not clear in some of these channels how to create that. And in a design process, you have to make choices. And so we made choices that, and another big choice we took was direct mirroring. In this, what Jeremy Burleson had done was this 4-second lagged delay. So 4 seconds is long enough to provide the social bond that provides the likability and persuasion, but it's short enough that it's short enough to provide that bond, but long enough to mitigate the awkward feeling that something is doing exactly what you do, what would be called direct or immediate mirroring.
Is the companion taking any direct part in the task or just sitting there?
Right, and so that's a good question. So the companion introduced Dweck's message and dialogued with the individual about the slideshow. It had a slideshow that it presented. It talked about how much you could use this strategy. It intervened at a point of mean quitting time in prior studies and said, hey, many people get frustrated at this. How's it going for you? Right? And so that's against some of the comments that we talked about earlier in terms of not wanting to intervene. If a student was in flow, that would have probably been a poor choice at that point. But to do the experiment, we had to ask that kind of question. More specifically, the character is not engaged in the Towers of Hanoi. It says, I know the rules, I'll watch and help if I can. Right? So it might have a chance to, from the user's perspective, but it actually doesn't. Right? So that's the context, and over that work and several iterations of that work, we've been able to, I'll just sort of go from the bottom to the top. First, the study was that we found gender-specific approaches, that girls responded by saying they were twice as frustrated when we didn't combine mirroring with the affective message. And we had 2 kinds of messages. The affective message, which was about the mind as being a muscle, and the task-based message, which was just about moving the discs. Didn't really provide much help, but it said some people like to move the big discs out of the way, and then they can put the small discs where they want to. Right? And so this was the kind of very significant results that we saw being different between boys and girls, and implying that the sensors were, at this stage of research, a very important part of the process. That by being able to do that mirroring, and by having that mirroring be in concert with the message, that you can mitigate frustration by a factor of 2. We also were able to detect quitting through these sensors. Through 2 minutes prior to the hitting of a quit button, we could detect quitting at 79% accuracy. So that is a portion, or we called it a very direct portion of the stuck or quitting behavior. And the idea that that's when, if we could understand that and didn't have a quit button, maybe those feelings would still occur, we would, at that time, provide this kind of message. We haven't sort of closed the loop on that entirely, but that's the kind of trajectory that this work allows for. The emotion sensors go to school in 2009 was the best paper at the AI Ed conference, and it showed that we could scale this work up to classrooms and provide it in, I'll say, real-world tasks. It's SAT questions. And so using problems that are presented, SAT prep or math prep, not the domain that we want to do the most of, but the domain that most intelligent tutoring systems are currently attacking. And so that's what the next part of the talk is about, how to get away to more open-ended experiences. So with the affective sensors, we had 25 students in a classroom using these sensors at the same time on their own one-on-one tutoring experiences. So we could move from the lab to standard computer classrooms in elementary school and sense 78 to 86% of the accuracy of emotions that are important to learning. And then most recently, getting back to a question earlier, looking at the gaming behavior or deeper or shallow learning. We can model when shallow learning is occurring. And what this generally means is asking for hints in too rapid succession. In this software, if you ask for hints again and again, you eventually get the answer. You can then plug in the answer and claim that you've gotten the right answer. If you do that again and again, then you're not learning much. There's no way that you could. And then you're not preparing yourself to do further work. So it's a form of the quitting. And so that's the kind of opportunity to look at when can we foster deep and shallow learning. So to get to the question of having more broader open-ended experiences, we've looked at teams of 3 and 4 individuals. This was some pilot work looking at at the classification done by Cindy Atman at UW. Cindy did this for individuals, and she looked at problem definition, information gathering, assessment, ideation, evaluation. And what she provided was about an hour-long experience in which she said, your task is to design a playground. Here's the initial brief, and I've got a lot of information. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. And so she was able to classify individuals that might look like this person here, or the upper left person on Team A. And what she found was that this person in Team A had a rich iterative process where they move between tasks, and that is the kind of activity that leads to a more solid solution, and in fact even alluding to, she didn't actually have measures of creativity, a more creative outcome. And so what we wanted to do was take her method, apply it not only to individuals, but look at teams. And so we did the same task in which not one person, but all 4 people were asked to work together. And this is the kind of work, kind of data that we collected initially. And I guess I would like to say at this time that we haven't, again, here gone far enough. An open question is, if we have an individual like this, who is a very simple, unsophisticated, or even this team is less sophisticated than Team A, if we take individuals from Team, the label got shifted. This is Team B, this is Team A, and this would be Team C. Oops. So if Team B individuals were, one of those individuals was exchanged with Team A, what would happen to those patterns? We haven't done that, but that's the kind of question that, that we'd like to look at next. And unfortunately, this takes a lot of work to do, a lot of coding, especially when you have multiple individuals. You have to code each of those and then collapse them. So that's the segue to the notion of trying to embed these sensors of team collaborative activity in everyday practices. So over the couple of years, we've had the chance to work with IDEO and the Human Media Group, Sandy Pentland's group, Human Dynamics Group, looking at if we have heads-up displays, if we have pendants or pens or rings, or as you'll see in a moment, smart badges that can sense motion or face-to-face interaction and measure audio elements, not recorded speech, but interactions, then we can start to understand some of these dynamics that occur in those teams. So what we've done with building these kinds of scenario-based prototypes, and then ultimately the prototypes that led to the skin conductance sensor and then to work on the smart badges, is to look at that. And before I go on with the, how we're going to do that in teams in real-world workplaces, I'd like to take a question.
Back to the very interesting diagrammatic slide.
Yeah, this one?
Again, it's kind of a scoping question. Did you look at things like meta issues of whether the participants were construing this as a competitive or cooperative or a neutral situation?
We didn't. In general, it was presented as a collaboration, and that there wasn't a notion that there was another team. So it was presented as a collaborative activity. What I would say about, we talked a little bit, again, at lunch about this, and some research being done here on providing actualizing rewards for creativity. And Amabile, hopefully, I probably talked about this as well, that environments that provide actualizing rewards as opposed to assessing individuals' competencies are ones that foster creativity to a great extent. So if you see others getting rewarded for creativity, rewarded not monetarily, but by having more team members or more resources provided so they can come up with better solutions. If somebody gets to, for example, this point, where this team is seen as being effective, maybe we'd give them a Wacom tablet or a 3D printer, right? And so, I mean, if these teams were all working, that would be a way that Amabile, I believe, would argue that the rest of the organization would see, hey, they got some resources for being creative. Creativity is welcome here. We're going to try and be much more creative than we are currently.
At that point, I feel like I've seen a TED video or some video online about motivation. It seemed on the surface like they were saying the opposite of that. That they were saying that when you reward, and you made a distinction that not monetarily, but is there really...
Right, so Amabile argues that, I mean, for a research scientist, to give them a bonus is not very effective, could even be detrimental, as opposed to giving them a flight or some time to go to a conference where they could learn more and interact with colleagues would be the kind of actualizing reward that would foster their intrinsic motivation and engagement in that workplace activity.
Do you have a guess as to what the key difference there is? Because I always sort of assumed that the problem with the monetary reward is that it would be like stressful to have that.
Well, it goes all the way back to her work on evaluation. I believe it. So she's done work with children, looking at if you say things as subtly different as, here's some crayons and we'd like you to play and come up with as many drawings or several drawings. I mean, maybe not as many, I mean, just draw, right? Versus, here's some crayons and we'd like to have you work on some drawings for us. That kind of framing can have detrimental effects in terms of the work being less creative than the play, right? And so I'm suggesting that that same kind of rewarding is at play. If even as simple in an experiment as individuals who did not know that their work would be judged versus work that would be judged. The people that were told that their work would be judged had lower levels of creativity. Right? So I think the difference is judged in terms of judged for a purpose that's consistent with the creativity that allows us all to get to where we want to go, that's aligned with the mission of the organization, versus judged in terms of whether it's good enough or not, right? Scott.
This is really interesting. It seems hard to know what to do with it. We can all think of teams that bounce back and forth too much. So I don't think the outcome is more bouncing back and forth around stages is always better.
No. I would say what we don't know, first of all, is, I mean, Cindy Atman did this work on individuals. This work hasn't been done in this way on teams.
Or even individuals. So even if you take individuals,
right.
I don't think you want to automatically say that more bouncing around is always better. And so
I don't think she called it bouncing around. I mean, the way she talked about it was iterative process that included multiple dimensions of activity, right? And so the idea that you can do a model or that you're making a choice between doing an evaluation or asking for more information or making a model at this point in time, that you are then, when you get more information, adding that to the model and then doing more evaluation about that result. So this process of what we would say from the product design tradition is express, test, cycle, but with more elements, saying what are we going to express, what are we going to test, how are we going to feed back the elements of the test into the express, so that, but I appreciate that what I was saying was this is very preliminary data, and it's and there's a rich opportunity to move forward with this.
Well, I guess I'm part of me is unconvinced that this is the right level of analysis.
Okay.
That I totally believe that many individuals under-iterate. And if you showed somebody, the flat line, and then an effective team, they could say, oh yeah, I ought to do more of that. So that makes sense. But I wonder whether it's too complex a model to have a simple predictive outcome, and too simple to actually actually give people more actionable, nuanced advice.
Right. Well, so the level of advice or assessment that Cindy Atman was able to do was to look at freshmen, seniors, and experts. And she essentially saw that seniors and experts had very similar patterns, and that freshmen were not experienced enough to have this. So I agree that this is a very gross level of assessment, and I think what is important is to appreciate that it works at that gross level, and that there are opportunities to move much further. And so what I think Uzgar Aries, who worked with Larry Leifer, and I and others have been looking at, and Delft in general, is the design observatory, and how and what ways is it effective to assess teams and look at processes. And so that's what I'll talk about next in terms of how we're using the smart badges to look at elements of creativity in a natural environment. And again, I think you'll find deficiencies here as well. That we only made certain measures and they're not yet useful.
But your point is a really good one, that, about the freshman example, that freshmen in aggregate under-iterate, and you can demonstrate with this method that one of the things that emerges out of expertise is increased iteration. Mm-hmm. And just that doesn't automatically mean that bouncing around is good.
And what Schoen would have said is reflection, right? And so that notion of this reflective, and Atman corroborated that. She felt that reflection being one of those very important elements in that area. Okay, so this work is work that sort of culminated over the years from that kind of slide and this desire to assess team creativity, and we looked at how to look at what Amabile saw as being the elements of creativity in the workplace, and used her Keys measures. Keys is a end-of-day survey that she provided to individuals, and then was coded for levels of creativity on a daily basis. And we were able to look at the relationship between the sensed behaviors and the actual surveyed behaviors. And so what we see here is the badges themselves. And again, they have IR cones that are 15 degrees. And so if I'm standing close to Jesse here and he's wearing a badge, then our badges would now see each other. And by seeing each other, we would start to build up this line here of a tie strength, right? And the more time we see each other, more time. I haven't walked over to Terry yet, and Terry's badge is looking in that direction. So maybe these two dots that are unconnected would represent us at this time, right? Scott and I have been talking, so we might have this distant kind of badge connection. Maybe our badges currently don't have the long distance range, and so in this case, we wouldn't have, it would be the same as with Terry. What they do have is the voice, and in this study we didn't use voice, but that's another element that this type of work with the badges works on. So it's motion, voice, and IR face-to-face strength tie, right? So that's the context. The experiment that we did looked at a team at Microsoft Research and teams at Arizona State in terms of IT research development teams, 5 to 7 people. And the basic study, as I suggested, was using Amabile's 2005 work in terms of the teams studies, where she had many organizations reporting a lot of data. We were doing sort of a pilot study version of that with the sensors, using Pentland's work on honest signals. So if you want to learn it, he's written a book in 2008 on honest signals. And then Tammy Kim's work that follows up. And Tammy was a student with Sandy Pentland and is now working in the Bay Area, looking at understanding organizations, dorms, Bank of America, any number of organizations, and providing feedback. And so this is the kind of data, since Amabile spoke and we're using a lot of time, this is, I'll just read these two. So I made a minor breakthrough today. It turned out I managed to create. Those would be linked to a positive or one or creative event. This one, besides that, I spent I spent the day adding a layer to connective tissue. Previously, this had been determined not to be so creative, just labor, and that would be a 0. So using that and machine learning from the data, we were able to use the PCA methods to classify up to 90% of the survey results. And so we can look at how we can measure creativity in the workplace with this. The main contributions from that work are that we found the relationships between team creativity and activity to be strong, that the face-to-face interaction and movement does predict. So what that means in general is that if you get up and go and meet somebody, even if both of these situations were in a co-located environment, in a room where you you're generally working on your own computer. But if you happen to think it was important enough to get up and go and meet somebody and have face-to-face contact with them, then that's the kinds of events that was related to creativity. We don't know if the creativity happened before, during, or after those events, and that's where, again, Scott's questions about resolution would play, and looking maybe at some other measures. For example, the next iteration of this study should have the skin conductance sensor, because Amabile's work also showed that the arousal levels or the affect were very important to the levels of creativity. And so that's what we'd like to do next in our planning to do. So we've talked about the affective learning companions and the creativity research. I'd like to share with you, and I'll go through this a little quicker than I planned, but some work that we're doing on extending the kind of learning environments to off-the-desktop environments. And so we were fortunate enough to get some funding from NSF for something called Game is Life, Life is Game. And the notion was that if you're playing a video game with a sensor, such as a data glove or Nike iTunes sensor, the accelerometer, that maybe the more you ran or the way you used your glove would affect the way you could actually play the video game. So using a little bit of the We Can Connect idea with the data glove, but going further to actually looking at your heartbeat or the amount of time or exercise that you've done, or the skin conductance, the level of affect that you've had, you can imagine an astronaut who gets a lot of sleep and is having, well, I'll get into that in a moment. We'll skip the astronaut for a moment. We'll talk about the meditation aspect. If in a game you saw an opportunity to meditate or earn a spell, you could get a lesson from this and use your respiration or your skin conductance low state of arousal as a training. And then the next day on a cell phone, you might get prompted to cast this spell in collaboration with others that would then give you a chance to exercise that meditative quality. Now, the reason you would do this could be through, I don't know, Tim Bickmore has looked at relational agents and the way that an agent can work in your life over time. And so you could, at the beginning of this game, either by sensing your life or negotiating with an agent, talk about to what extent you're interested in sleep, exercise, or meditation, and have that be a parameter that goes in. Ultimately, you could look at to what extent can you motivate, or can the game engine or your peers be motivated to provide you aspects of an optimal life that, that you might lead to. So this notion of moving from your stuck states in different channels of your personal projects into the actualized states. And so while that's a grand vision, we had to focus on a few specific things. And one of the areas that we're focusing on is on the dressing and undressing behavior of people with mild cognitive impairments. So the history here is that we built this system over here on the right where we had a lot of the virtual hardware and software and then the physical hardware and software in the smart home environment. And then what we're doing right now is putting these sensors on the front of these interfaces into the everyday environment and looking at, can we support some of the e-health multimedia services that connect caregivers and their patients and their doctors. So this is work that's funded by the Alzheimer's Association and is now going into the Smart Health solicitation. So that's the kind of work that's the kind of system and application that we've been going for. There's also in Persuasive Technologies a paper coming out on autism and how this kind of system can be used with individuals with autism and their caregivers to design personalized interfaces. And so if you, and we did, sit down with teenagers with autism and their caregivers and ask them how they would like to have these sensors. And they ranged from looking at motivation for brushing teeth that they weren't doing, they weren't maintaining their oral hygiene. And so these are co-designed and participatory design activities where a technologist, a caregiver, and a person living with autism come together and work on a scenario and then are able to build their own smart home intervention that facilitates their work. So that paper presents a guideline that goes beyond the current guidelines for caretakers. We use the current guidelines to inform how smart home guidelines could change the relationship between the caregiver and the recipient. And now we're moving into the mild cognitive impairment as well. So that's an introduction to the system and its potential. Here's a floor plan with a number of sensors. We'll not dwell on that. But to go back to the learning environment, we've been, at ASU, we have the School of Earth and Space Exploration. And we've been looking at how to provide opportunities for learning in complex mission segments across teams as large as 50 individuals working together not only at ASU but also at MIT and JPL. And so I'd like to share with you a little video that describes the kind of class that we've done across these. We got funding from JPL to work with MIT on this as well. Oops, here we go.
Learning in places like your dorm, or learning in the swimming pool, or in the coffee shop, or when you're on the soccer field is a really different thing than learning in the classroom. And sometimes some kinds of learning are much more effective in those other kinds of environments.
We designed our mission to have as much in as we can so that if nothing goes wrong, there is always still something to do. So there's like redundancies of, like having more science.
So the research problem that we've tackled in the classes is the optimization of the scientific return from the lunar surface. And we've done this for 2 years now. Last year, in our initial exploration, we were having the students use an environment that was more or less static. They could explore the environment, but they didn't have resources on the surface. They didn't have astronauts or robots that they could move around in the physical space. As the work evolved, we developed the roles of the astronaut and robots and have a very unique simulator that allows real-time positioning to be updated from a real person and a real robot in the Mars yard at JPL.
Copy that, mission control, proceeding on part 3 of the lunar structure, over.
For our purposes, Decision Theater is a really unique environment for students to think about being in an environment that they cannot be a part of on this planet.
Did the amount of time you guys took to try and figure that out and solve it, did it compromise the science in any way?
One really valuable way to teach, particularly in the world of science and engineering, is to literally eliminate the boundary between education and research.
We're taking a research-based approach both to the education and to the science, and we really believe that that combination of those two is fundamental to the success of our class, but even more importantly, to the success of education as we move forward into the future, to not only empowering and developing the best students, but to providing solutions that our world very much needs at this time.
Okay, lights up, please. All right, so this is the Decision Theater, and we used it, it's used to gather people and create decisions and study decision making. We used it, as was shown in the video, for an advanced classroom, and we created a high resolution image of the Apollo 15 lunar landing site, and we created the topology of the Mars yard and looked at how these missions and contingencies could play across large scale teams. So here, again, there's the opportunity to create the kinds of sensing and assessment of classrooms and large teams and understand what kind of learning is going on. We're not at a point where we've done that yet, but that's the kind of opportunity that we are looking at in terms of taking the next step, moving the desktop intelligent tutoring systems off the desktop into these kinds of environments. We've also gone out into the field with NASA, looked at how they use their cutting edge tools. So it's a spectrum of a real integration of the research tools and the education. And that's the kind of opportunities that, in terms of the Inventors Workshop, we want to create an environment where people can come in and ask any question and get access to the kinds of skills and expertise that they need to advance their questions. We've also been looking at the kinds of gaming interfaces that can be provided in terms of managing resources and providing altered realities that might inform where to look for life in terms of where the water was, things of that nature. And then looking at how some of these tools and techniques can go into classrooms and create educational experiences. We've teamed up with iRobot and created the following 2 experiences that I want to share with you. So this is a picture at Makers Faire in San Mateo, And it's kids playing with a robot. They're mostly just playing with it, but I want to point out a few features. This is a border or a feature of the environment. And so what's going on here is that this has a wireless camera and it can sense the fiducials. And the kids, and we've found 3 forms of programming that can occur in this environment. There's the environmental programming, like the border or the maze that you see in the middle. There's the just-in-time programming, which you'll see in this video. And then there's sequential programming, which would be to place these arrows or icons in an arrangement that would achieve a goal, such as going through the maze. And so we presented some of that work at IDC as well. So let me show you this video. Here you go. Not found. Sorry. Hopefully this will be found. Here we go. OK. So this is was at a Sally Ride Festival. And that symbol there is a U-turn. Now, if kids were given a limited number of cards, such as the U-turn and this next symbol, which is the repeat last icon, then they could arrange them in this formation to create an infinite loop, right? So this kid, so that's an example of, here's the whole stack of cards you saw in the background could be created, and now this kid has found another way to create an infinite loop. So it's just in time, but it's with a goal. Right? And so these are looking at how to provide elements of computational thinking very seamlessly to a large age range and change some of the elements. This is sort of the simplest infinite loop. It's a Go 360. And as soon as it sees it, you could call it a bug. Maybe there's no way out. But it also affords a just-in-time interaction. So I would argue maybe it's not a bug, because as it's spinning around, you can always enter a new card and change. It's a holding pattern, right? And so you could create that kind of discussion. So we've presented some of this work on integrating video games and physical play environments in SIGGRAPH in 2008. We even interacted with a theater group called Center Theater Group. And unfortunately, due to the financial crisis, the performance was canceled. But we got to play around with what would the robotic actors on stage do with human actors, and so we created a number of these pictures of kinds of actors that could engage and be social agents, not too unlike the learning companions in the physical real-world environment. This was another project with Education and Robots from LEGO, looking at a Wizard of Oz technique and a design prototyping where kids were programming with these little click-it icons that they could put on top of the robot, and then they could decorate their robots. And again, it's Wizard of Oz. You see a little string here, but it shows how far you can get with some of the interactions. Sorry. So the notion is that they're wearing hand sensors and they're clapping and jumping. And part of this was also to look at physical activity and play and potentially mitigation of obesity. So this was a tug of war.
Wait a minute.
Eventually, we want to have sort of online environments merge with the physical environments and look at how we can do that. We've been talking with LEGO for a number of years about different ways to look at that. With a few minutes, I just want to mention the Inventors Workshop and then open it for questions. So ASU is trying to transform the vision for a university that can have access, excellence, and impact. That means anybody can come. There's a broad access. Excellence means that when they leave, they're very well equipped. And impact is that they're equipped to have an impact on society and benefit society. And so we've created the Inventors Workshop where we're inviting people to ask, act, and do or learn. So the first 2 questions we had were, can I make synthetic life? And what's the fractal nature of dance? And so if you went into the Stanford machine shop and said, I want to build a Teflon-coated waffle iron, they'd be excited. They'd say, sure, I'll help you do that. Sounds like a good semester project. If you said, I want to build an atomic force microscope, they would say, that's great. We're all about electromechanical systems. Might take a year or so, but we can do it together. We have the skills. But if you said, I want to build a DNA nanowire, or I want to make synthetic life, or like I did, want to go to the top of the canopy and scuba dive in the canopy or traverse the canopy with a canopy trek device, they don't quite know how to handle that question. And my argument with the Inventors Workshop is that by aggregating tool sets and expertise, we can create an environment, not today, but hopefully sooner than later, where we can start to answer those questions. And the context of our society is one in which we have hacker-maker spaces where people are asking some of these great questions. There's a DIY nuclear site. You can go and learn how to build some nuclear devices, and people do in their basements in New York. So it's interesting and scary, and so what I would argue are the core elements of an Inventors Workshop are that you have a module on inventioneering, which is about asking, answering, doing, iterating, expressing, testing, cycle. Basically, to some great extent, the design philosophy coupled with how to ask and answer great questions with an ask and answer and do process. And so I spoke with Michael Crow, the president of ASU, and he said, I worry about a future in the not too distant future in which the best or the most wealthy students go to MIT or Stanford and pay $150,000 a year while everybody else learns online in their basement. Right? And so what the Inventors Workshop does, and what my efforts to move the intelligent tutoring systems off the desktops does, is to create the place-based physical environment where you can come together, learn something, and then teach something. And so it marries the passion of the DIY maker movement with the access and excellence of a research university. And so if we can do that again and again, then we can create eventually a US innovation core or a global innovation core that would allow us to create the kinds of environments that we need to have to solve the grand challenges that we're facing. Because if we don't prepare ourselves to a much greater extent than we're even prepared today, even our best students, as well as we are prepared, we are facing these kind of tremendously wicked problems. If you don't know what a wicked problem is, look up wicked problem. That's the kind of problem that we need to be able to solve. And if we don't create the environment where anyone, anywhere can access and learn, we might be failing at, ultimately failing to move our society forward in the ways that we would like to see it. A specific strategy to do that is to take what was started with Froebel and his gifts. Froebel was the father of modern kindergarten. He created 20 gifts, and the notion of the gifts was that the gifts teach something to the learner through discovery that is hard for them to discover, or that is hard for them to be taught if they didn't discover it themselves. And so modern gifts, Mitch Resnick at MIT Media Lab said we need digital gifts. I'm arguing that elements of instructables are a whole repertoire of gifts. We need 1,000 gifts or 10,000 gifts that provide us the opportunities with the gift of DNA, the gift of imagination, the gift of water, the gift of time, the gift of perspective, the gift of raising your hand 2 inches higher. These are, Bruce Mao has a massive change initiative, and he's got 24 hours in which each hour has a notion of a gift. And so by aggregating the gifts that do exist and finding gaps in which we don't have gifts, the Inventors Workshop is looking at the combination of the virtual and the physical environments that allow us to go much further than we could without such an environment. And so that goes back to why do we need credit for this class, whether it should be all online, is our CV, our resume, and what's the relationship. So have a few minutes. Again, I'll be here after the hour to speak with anybody for longer periods of time as well.
Go back to the first part of the presentation or not, but I guess I have a question about experience. I research on experience. I'd like to know, how do you define experience? And going back to the first part of your presentation, how exactly are you mapping those analog signals to those variables that would allow me to measure experience? Well,
I think this has to do, you know, a corollary to this question again at lunch was how do you measure affect, right? And so this notion of, do we do it right now? What is your experience in the moment? Or do we have a mood or a life quality? I think there's scales or resolutions, right? And I mean, I think from a design perspective, we were taught here, you know, to do how-why diagrams and look at what are you really asking. So if I'm asked to build a bridge, I might say, well, do you really need a bridge, or do you need a kayak service or a scuba diving service to get across, right? You know, why am I building a bridge? And that's what the design program says about the ability of training engineers to ask the why. So I would ask the why of the experience. I would define experience in many different ways, ranging from a life experience to your experience here today to, you know, so I think there's elements from a number of different disciplines, quality of life. There's experience sampling method that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi used, which said, if I give you a pager, to what extent are you in flow and what are you doing today? So another one is the quit. If you hit quit, I've measured a very precise moment of your experience. But again, since it's so broad, I'd be happy to speak with you after. Good question.
So go back to your slide about using your smart values. With, so you said something about building a machine learned model. So what was, so two questions. What does a model try and predict? And you said something about tie strength and what it predicts.
Right. So what I was talking about is the major elements that we classified. There were three. We measured with the keys measure, which is the self-report, team report instrument that Amabile uses, which is one of the standards, gold standards, if you will, of creativity research. Right? So that's one. The other two were the movement from the accelerometer, and then the face-to-face tie strength, or the amount of time I spend talking, or if I have done that at all. Right? And those three elements, the latter two were used to classify, the first. Right?
So essentially, it's saying that depending on how much face-to-face interaction I have during the day and how much I move around, you can sort of...
We can predict 90% of the creativity.
So you can predict whether I will be creative or
in not will, but were. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right.
At least positively correlated. And
right.
Move around more, are you more creative?
Yeah, I mean, in these environments. So again, I mean, Terry asked the question about U-shaped curves, and I mean, in these two data sets that were probably not the extreme of either being sedentary or being mobile, that they were positively correlated in that context. And the context was a research lab either at Microsoft Research or at Arizona State.
And you're doing the prediction as at end of day, did you do something creative today? Is that right?
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. Across several weeks of data and multiple individuals. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, thanks. Yes.
So you touched on it towards the end, but I wanted to hear more about the Lego project and what looked like a web portal and.
Right. So there's a picture of Lego Universe. Unfortunately, Lego Universe was a long time in the making and then launched and then closed. But the notion of Lego Universe was that you could build in an open-ended play environment and collaborate and learn. And so we were looking at collaborations of how the astronaut robot mission simulator could be developed in a Lego Universe-like online gaming environment where we don't know how to go back to the moon. We don't know the right combinations of astronauts and robots. But in the same way that we do Protein Folded, open source science, could we create environments around astronaut robot mission simulators and other team collaborative environments that go much beyond Protein Folded or SETI at Home or some of the others that create these kind of combinations of physical, if you do have the robots and can interact with them, because we believe that you can't just do it in simulation, that there are many physical elements that pertain to this as well. But you can do a lot in simulation, and so when you don't have access to some of the physical, we would like you to do it in simulation. That's what the Inventors Workshop would do, is have level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. So 0 is your home, which goes from really high-end simulation all the way back to your kitchen or fake robots like the Wizard of Oz experiment. Level 1 is your local hack shop, and level 2 is undergrad research labs like the Stanford Machine Shop. I would say the Machine Shop is like level 2.8 or 9. 3 is a research lab where you have a higher end. You can do deposition, vapor deposition, other work that you can't do. And then 4 is a world-class instrument. So, for example, a personal experience was, as a junior in high school, we were trained to determine the orbit of an asteroid on a level 2 instrument. We then had a chance to use the Space Telescope to look for binary asteroids 2 years later. Right? And that's the kind of opportunity where you train somebody really well and then give them access to really high-end instruments. That is the kind of learning experience that I believe we need to provide to a much greater extent. If we have 1% for the arts, maybe we should have 5 to 10% for STEM. And that this rising of our capacity to answer tough questions would have the ability to actually help us move forward in some of our grand challenges.
Okay, good ending line. Glenn will be here if you want to come and ask more questions.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.